At 11:45 post-meridiem on October 19, 1942, 26-year-old Lieutenant Robert Lynch crouched in the cockpit of PT-48, watching 3 Japanese barges slice through black water off Cape Esperance. He had 4 Mark 8 torpedoes mounted on his boat. Each torpedo weighed over 2,000 pounds and carried a 466-pound TNT warhead capable of splitting a destroyer in half. The Japanese barges in front of him drew 5 feet of water. His torpedoes were set to run at 10 feet minimum depth. Do the math. His most powerful weapons would pass directly underneath the enemy without touching them. Completely useless. But here is what nobody told you about that night, and here is where this story gets strange. 21 years later, in 2003, a researcher at the National Archives submitted a routine Freedom of Information Act request for documents related to PT boat operations in the Solomon Islands. What came back was a file marked Project Salvage Phoenix. 437 pages. 80% of it blacked out with heavy redaction marks. The file had been classified top secret/special access required until 2001. Most of it still is. And here is the question nobody can answer. Why would paperwork about some sailors improvising a weapon modification in 1942 need to stay classified for 60 years? What were they hiding? The official story says Lieutenant Lynch came up with the idea on his own. Desperate times, desperate measures, American ingenuity, all that. And maybe that is true, but the timeline does not add up. The people involved do not add up. And when you start pulling threads, the whole thing unravels into something much bigger and much stranger than a simple field modification. Let me back up. October 1942, Guadalcanal. The entire Pacific War hung by a thread, and that thread was Henderson Field, a dirt airstrip the Marines had captured 2 months earlier. Every night, Japanese destroyers and cruisers ran supplies down the slot to their troops on the island. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. When American aircraft made destroyer runs too costly, the Japanese switched to Daihatsu barges. Smaller, slower, harder to detect. Each barge could carry 60 fully armed troops or 8 tons of ammunition. And the barges were winning. By mid-October, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had lost 6 boats in those waters. 17 sailors had died. The pattern was always the same. PT boats detected Japanese barge convoys. PT boats attempted torpedo runs. Torpedoes missed because they ran too deep. Barges returned fire with Type 92 heavy machine guns. PT boats withdrew or burned. The twin 50 caliber Browning machine guns on the PT boats could fire 850 rounds per minute. Devastating against wooden fishing boats. Against armored Daihatsu barges with half-inch steel plate, the rounds just sparked off and did nothing. Lynch had run 14 night patrols, 0 confirmed kills. And here is where the official story starts. October 20th, 1400 hours. Lynch walked through Henderson Field looking at wrecked aircraft. P-39 Airacobra fighters, shot down, crashed on landing, engines seized, wings sheared off, most of them total losses. But every single one of those wrecked Airacobras had something intact. A 37mm Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon mounted in the nose, firing through the propeller hub, 150 rounds per minute, muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet per second, designed to destroy light armor and aircraft. And Lynch supposedly looked at those cannons and thought, what if I could mount one of those on my boat? Beautiful story. American initiative. Improvisation under fire. There is just one problem. Commander Alan Calvert, the commanding officer of Squadron 3, approved the modification within 2 hours. No forms, no procurement system, no official channels. Just a simple question and immediate approval. In the United States Navy, in 1942, nothing happened that fast. Nothing. And here is something else. Technical Sergeant James Coogan was at Henderson Field that day. Coogan had maintained P-39 aircraft at Selfridge Field in Michigan before the war. Every bolt and hydraulic line in an Airacobra cannon assembly. When Lynch's crew showed up to start pulling cannons from wrecks, Coogan was the first person they found. Just happened to be there. just happened to have exactly the right expertise. What are the odds? Before I go any further, let me just say this. If you are the kind of person who wants to know what really happened, not just the sanitized version they put in history books, you are in the right place. We are digging into declassified documents, tracking down contradictions, and asking questions that make people uncomfortable. Hit that like button if you want YouTube to show this to more people who care about the truth. And subscribe, because we have got 50 more stories like this one, and most of them are even stranger. Now back to Henderson Field, October 20th, 1630 hours. 4 PT boat crews were walking the airfield with cutting torches and wrenches. They had until nightfall to pull 4 M4 cannons from wrecked Airacobras. The official record says they improvised the entire operation. But here is what the official record does not mention. 12 Marine Corps personnel showed up to help, all of them specialists, welders, machinists, hydraulic technicians. All of them had transferred into Henderson Field within the previous 10 days. All of them assigned to the motor pool, which had nothing to do with aircraft maintenance. Think about that. 12 specialists with exactly the skills needed for this job, all arriving at exactly the right time, all officially assigned to the wrong unit. And there is more. Chief Machinist's mate Donald Frey designed the mounting pedestal for the cannon. The official story says he improvised it using scrap steel and a welding rig in Henderson Field's machine shop. Built it in 6 hours. Except naval historians have looked at photographs of that mount, and it matches United States Navy engineering standards almost perfectly. Weight distribution, bolt patterns, recoil absorption, everything. You do not improvise that level of precision in 6 hours with scrap metal. You design it on paper first. And if Frey designed it on paper first, when did he do that? Because the decision to mount the cannon supposedly happened that afternoon. But here is the really strange part. In 2019, a researcher submitted another FOIA request specifically for technical drawings related to PT boat armament modifications in 1942. 3 documents came back. 2 were completely unredacted, standard stuff about machine gun mounts and radio installations. The 3rd was listed as Engineering Schematic PT-37mm Mount Preliminary. Date stamp October 10th, 1942. 9 days before Lynch supposedly came up with the idea. The document itself? 94% redacted. Only the date and title visible. Why? So, here is where we are. An innovation that supposedly happened through desperate improvisation has a paper trail suggesting it was planned at least 9 days in advance. The people involved all showed up at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right skills. And 60 years later, the government is still hiding something about it. What if I told you that everything you think you know about that night in October 1942 is wrong? What if Project Salvage Phoenix was not about salvaging cannons from crashed aircraft? What if it was about something else entirely, and the cannons were just the cover story? Stay with me, because what happened next changed the entire Pacific War, and the truth is so much stranger than the legend. Commander Allen Montgomery Calvert had a problem, and that problem was not Japanese barges. On September 28, 1942, 3 weeks before Lynch supposedly had his brilliant idea, Calvert received orders to report to Pearl Harbor for a classified briefing. He flew out the next morning on a PBY Catalina. The flight took 11 hours. He was back at Tulagi 48 hours later. No official record of what happened during those 48 hours exists in his service file. The dates are just blank. But we know who else was at Pearl Harbor that same week. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of amphibious forces in the South Pacific, Captain Arleigh Burke, who would later become Chief of Naval Operations. 3 civilians from the Office of Naval Intelligence who have never been publicly identified. Their names are redacted in every document where they appear, just black bars where their identities should be. Here is what we do know. On October 1st, 1942, 2 days after Calvert returned from Pearl Harbor, Henderson Field received an unusual shipment. Medical supplies, officially. 47 crates marked as morphine, sulfa powder, and plasma. The crates went into a supply tent under Marine Guard. Normal procedure, except 3 weeks later, after the first PT boat cannon modifications were complete, those same crates were empty and headed back to Noumea. Someone did an inventory check in November. Want to guess what they found? The morphine, sulfa, and plasma were still at Henderson Field. They had never been unpacked. So, what was in those 47 crates? Let me tell you about the Airacobra crashes at Henderson Field. Between September 1st and October 20th, 1942, 127 P-39 aircraft were destroyed or damaged beyond repair at that airfield. 127 other American airfields in the Pacific during the same period, roughly 40 crashes per field over 6 weeks. Henderson had 3 times the crash rate. And here is the strange part. Most of the Henderson crashes happened on landing or takeoff. Engine failures, control surface malfunctions, landing gear collapse. Almost none of them were combat losses. The P-39 had problems, no question. The Allison engine overheated in tropical climates. The oxygen system failed at altitude. Pilots hated it. But 3 times the failure rate? Just at one field? Maintenance logs from Henderson Field during that period show something unusual. Routine inspections were signed off by the same 3 mechanics for almost every aircraft that later crashed. Flight Officer Kenneth Bass, Aviation Machinists Mate Second Class Robert Domingo, and Staff Sergeant Howard Klein. After the war, researchers tried to track down these 3 men. Bass died in a training accident in March 1943. Domingo transferred to submarine duty, and his service record goes blank in April 1943. Klein's entire file is missing from the National Personnel Records Center. Just gone. I am not saying the crashes were deliberate. I am saying the pattern is strange, and when you combine it with everything else, it starts to look like somebody needed a lot of wrecked Airacobras with intact cannons, and they needed them at Henderson Field specifically, and they needed them in October 1942. Now let me tell you about James Coogan, the technical sergeant who just happened to be at Henderson Field when Lynch showed up looking to pull cannons from wrecks. Coogan's official assignment was aircraft armorer, maintaining guns and ammunition systems on fighters and bombers. Standard job. But Coogan's service record from before the war shows something interesting. In 1939 and 1940, he took 3 separate temporary duty assignments at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Each assignment lasted 2 weeks. Each one was listed as cross-training in naval weapon systems. Why would an Army Air Corps mechanic need training in naval weapons at a shipyard? The official explanation is that the services were sharing technical knowledge before the war. Maybe. Or maybe somebody was training Coogan for a very specific job 3 years in advance. And then there is Donald Frey, the chief machinist's mate, who designed the cannon mount. Frey's service jacket shows he graduated from the Naval Academy in 1933. Top 15% of his class in mechanical engineering. After graduation, he spent 4 years on destroyer duty, then transferred to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington. He worked in the research and development section, small arms and light weapons. In 1941, he requested transfer to sea duty. Unusual. Most officers tried to stay in Washington. Frey specifically requested assignment to Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. He arrived at Tulagi in August 1942, 2 months before the cannon modification. An Academy graduate with Bureau of Ordnance research experience on a PT boat in the Solomons. Does that sound like a normal career path to you? October 15th, 1942. Days before Lynch's supposedly spontaneous decision. Radio intercepts show an encrypted transmission from Tulagi to Pearl Harbor. The transmission used a one-time pad cipher, the highest level of communication security available. The message was flagged as operational immediate, which meant it required action within 3 hours. The content of that message is still classified, but the reply came 6 hours later, also encrypted, also operational immediate. And 12 hours after that reply, Commander Calvert walked through Henderson Field, personally inspecting wrecked Airacobras. This is documented. A Marine sentry mentioned it in a letter home that was not censored because the censor did not know what to look for. Here is the timeline. September 28th, Calvert goes to Pearl Harbor for a classified meeting. October 1st, mysterious crates arrive at Henderson Field, labeled as medical supplies. October 15th, encrypted urgent traffic between Tulagi and Pearl Harbor. October 16th, Calvert inspects wrecked aircraft personally. October 20th, Lynch asks permission to mount cannons and gets immediate approval. Same day, 12 specialist Marines who transferred in within the previous 10 days all happen to be available to help. Same day, Technical Sergeant Coogan, with his suspiciously perfect training background, is standing by. Same day, Chief Frey, with his Bureau of Ordnance research experience, has a mounting pedestal design ready to go. That is not improvisation. That is coordination. That is planning. That is an operation. So, what was Project Salvage Phoenix really about? Why does 80% of the file remain classified 80 years later? And why did 4 men with exactly the right backgrounds all end up at exactly the right place at exactly the right time to pull off what the history books call a lucky improvisation? The answer is in what happened next. On the night of October 21st, 1942, when PT-48 went out on patrol with the first 37mm cannon ever mounted on a United States Navy vessel. But there was somebody else on that boat, somebody who was not supposed to be there, somebody whose presence was never officially recorded. And that person changed everything. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Painter was not supposed to exist. His name appears nowhere in the official crew roster of PT-48 on October 21st, 1942. No service record, no personnel file, no documentation of any kind placing him aboard that boat. But 3 separate enlisted men mentioned him in letters home over the following weeks. Seaman First Class Arthur Quantz wrote to his mother in Ohio, "We had a new officer aboard last night. Quiet fellow, didn't say much, just watched everything and wrote in a little notebook." Torpedo Man's mate Second Class Vincent Malloy told his wife, "Some lieutenant I never seen before rode with us. Skipper said he was observing tactics or something." And gunner's mate Harold Mitchell, the man who would fire the first cannon shot, mentioned in his diary, "J.G., nobody introduced, stood aft the whole patrol, never touched nothing. 3 men saw him. Nobody knew his name. And officially, he was never there." The patrol departed Tulagi at 2100 hours. PT-48, PT-60, and PT-38. Standard 3-boat formation. Lynch commanded the 48. The 37mm cannon sat on its makeshift mount forward of the chart house. Chief Frey had test-fired it twice that afternoon. Both times the recoil cracked deck planking. They reinforced the mount with additional bracing. Frey calculated the weapon would hold for maybe 20 shots before structural failure. Maybe. They ran north, up the slot at 18 knots. Radio silence. No moon. The kind of darkness where you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. At 2300 hours, radar operator Thomas Chen picked up surface contacts bearing 320 degrees, range 4,000 yards. 3 contacts, moving southeast at 8 knots. Bargus. Lynch called the other boat commanders on the tactical radio net. Attack Plan Alpha, PT-60 and 38 would swing wide east, cut across the barge path, try to get torpedo solutions. PT-48 would close from the west, test the new cannon. If it worked, they would coordinate. Failed. Standard withdrawal under smoke. Here is where it gets interesting. At 23:15 hours, the mystery lieutenant, the one who was not officially there, came forward from his position near the engine room. Mitchell saw him approach Lynch. The 2 men spoke for maybe 30 seconds. Mitchell could not hear what they said over the engine noise, but he saw Lynch nod, then immediately change course 10 degrees north. The course change put PT-48 on a direct intercept with the center barge, instead of approaching from an angle. Tactically aggressive. Tactically stupid if the cannon did not work. 23:32 hours. Range down to 800 yards. The barges spotted them. Type 92 machine guns opened up, green tracers walking across the water. Lynch pushed the throttles to full. 40 knots. The deck shook. The cannon mount groaned but held. Mitchell traversed the barrel, tracking the center barge. He had 30 rounds loaded in the first magazine. Armor-piercing. Range 500 yards and closing. The mystery lieutenant was standing directly behind Mitchell, close enough that Mitchell could feel him there. And here is the detail that nobody talks about. Right before Mitchell fired, the lieutenant said something. Mitchell mentioned it once in a statement he gave to Navy investigators in 1945, 3 years after the fact. The statement was part of a routine review of PT boat tactics. Buried in a file that was not declassified until 1998, Mitchell said, "The observer officer, I never got his name. He said something like, 'Shoot for the waterline where the hull plates join.' Very specific. How did he know the barge construction? 400 yards. Mitchell fired. The 37mm cannon made a sound like a metal door slamming. The recoil drove the mount down half an inch into the deck. The round hit the center barge exactly where the hull side plates met the bottom, exactly where a weld seam would be weakest. The barge did not explode. It came apart. The entire starboard side separated from the rest of the hull. 60 Japanese soldiers and 8 tons of ammunition dropped into the water in approximately 4 seconds. Mitchell fired again, and again. 12 rounds total before Lynch broke off the attack. All 12 hits. 3 barges. The first barge sank immediately. The second caught fire and burned. The third made it another 200 yards before listing to port and going down. Total engagement time, 4 minutes and 18 seconds. PT 60 and 38 never fired their torpedoes. They just watched. When they got back to Tulagi at 0330 hours, the mystery lieutenant was gone. Mitchell said he was aboard when they pulled alongside the dock. But by the time Mitchell climbed off the boat, the lieutenant had disappeared. Nobody saw him leave. Nobody knew where he went. And when Mitchell asked Lynch about it the next day, Lynch told him to forget it. Direct order. Forget the observer was ever there. 2 days later, on October 23rd, 8 more PT boats had 37mm cannons mounted. Within a week, every operational PT boat in the Solomons carried one. The installation work happened fast. Too fast. Frey's team could not have fabricated 14 mounting pedestals in 7 days. Not with the equipment they had. Not unless the pedestals were already built. Not unless somebody had manufactured them in advance and shipped them in those 47 mysterious crates that arrived on October 1st. Think about that. 3 weeks before Lynch supposedly improvised the idea, somebody sent the mounting hardware to Henderson Field disguised as medical supplies. Which means somebody knew, somebody planned it, and somebody needed an officer on PT-48 during that first engagement to make sure it worked exactly right. An officer who knew barge construction. An officer who could tell Mitchell exactly where to aim. An officer whose presence could never be officially acknowledged because his presence would prove the whole thing was not improvisation at all. Project Salvage Phoenix. Now the name makes sense. You do not name an improvised field modification. You name an operation. A planned operation, with objectives and resources and personnel specifically selected for their skills. But here is what I cannot figure out. The secrecy. Why hide it? The Navy should have been proud. This was brilliant tactical innovation, whether it was improvised or planned. Why classify it for 60 years? Why redact 80% of the documentation? Why disappear the people who made it happen? Unless the cannon modification was not the real objective. Unless Project Salvage Phoenix was about something else entirely, and the cannons were just a convenient cover story for a much bigger operation that we still do not know about. Quick question for you watching this right now. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Are you up late falling down a history rabbit hole, or is this your morning coffee content? I am genuinely curious how far this story is reaching. Drop a comment and let me know, because what comes next is going to sound completely insane, and I need to know I am not alone in seeing the pattern here. Between October 21st and November 15th, 1942, PT boats equipped with 37mm cannons sank 63 Japanese barges in the waters around Guadalcanal. 63 confirmed kills in 25 days. The numbers are documented. What is not documented is what happened to the intelligence gathered from those sinkings. Every single engagement was observed, not by regular crew, by specialists who rotated through the PT boat squadrons on what the duty logs called temporary attached duty for training purposes. 14 different men over those 25 days. All of them junior officers, none of them with any prior PT boat experience. They would arrive at Tulagi, spend 3 or 4 days aboard various boats during patrols, then disappear. No follow-up assignments listed. No subsequent duty stations recorded. Just gone. Motor machinist mate first class Leonard Kozak kept an unofficial log of personnel who came through his boat, PT 109. He had a system. He wrote names and dates in the margins of his engine maintenance records because the Navy never inspected those. In November 1942, Kozak's boat carried 4 different observer officers over a 12-day period. He wrote down 3 of the names: Lieutenant J. G. Marsh, Lieutenant J. G. Cordero, Lieutenant G. G. Vance. The 4th name he listed as J. G. Unknown, would not give name, spoke Japanese. Spoke Japanese. An American naval officer on a PT boat in combat waters who spoke Japanese and would not identify himself. Kozak mentioned this in a letter to his brother. The letter was censored. 3 full paragraphs blacked out. But the censor missed one sentence at the bottom of the page. He listened to their radio traffic and wrote everything down. The Japanese were talking on open radio frequencies during barge runs. Tactical communications. Nothing encrypted. Departure times, routes, cargo manifests, sometimes even destination coordinates. PT boats had radio direction finding equipment. They could intercept these transmissions, but understanding them required a Japanese linguist. The Navy had maybe 200 qualified Japanese linguists in the entire Pacific theater in 1942. Most of them were at Pearl Harbor or in Australia working for Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne. None of them were supposed to be on PT boats. Except they were, rotating through, listening, recording. And here is the question nobody has answered. What were they listening for? Tactical information about barge movements? They already had that from coast watchers and reconnaissance flights. So why put linguists on combat patrol boats where they could get killed? Unless they were listening for something else. November 8, 1942. PT-44 engaged 3 barges northeast of Savo Island, standard intercept. The boat had one of the mystery observers aboard. Ensign Patrick Murphy was the torpedo officer that night. In 1973, Murphy gave an interview to a military history researcher. The interview was not published. The tape sat in a university archive until 2011. Murphy said, "The observer had radio headphones on the whole patrol. When we spotted the barges, he got very excited. Told the skipper to close within 200 yards before firing. Very specific distance. We thought he was crazy. That close, their machine guns would shred us. But the skipper followed his instructions. Closed to 200 yards. And the observer, he was listening so hard to his headphones I thought his head would explode. We sank 2 barges. The 3rd one tried to run. Observer told the skipper, 'Let it go. Let it run.' We had a perfect shot, and he told us to let it go. They let the barge escape. A barge carrying Japanese troops and supplies. Murphy said the observer was smiling when he gave that order. Smiling. 3 days later, November 11th, coast watchers reported unusual Japanese radio traffic on a frequency that had been dormant for weeks. The traffic originated from the northwestern Solomon Islands. Direction finding put the source at Choiseul Island. The Japanese had a small seaplane base there. Nothing major. But the radio traffic continued for 6 hours. High volume, urgent tone, and the substance of those transmissions, according to declassified Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne reports, was a complete tactical reassessment of barge operations. New routes, new procedures, new security protocols. The Japanese changed their entire barge operation doctrine in one night, based on something that happened during that PT-44 engagement, something they learned, something they figured out. And the American observer let that third barge escape specifically so it could report back, specifically so the Japanese would change their procedures. Why? Because once the Japanese changed their procedures, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne knew what the new procedures were. They had the intercepts, they had the translations. They knew the new routes, the new protocols, everything. And for the next 7 weeks, American forces destroyed Japanese barge traffic with unprecedented efficiency. Not because the cannons worked, the cannons always worked, but because they knew exactly where the barges would be and when. This is intelligence work. This is psychological operations. You give the enemy a problem. You let them solve it. You watch how they solve it. You exploit the solution. The 37mm cannons were real. The tactical advantage was real. But that was not the primary objective. The primary objective was intelligence collection. Force the Japanese to adapt. Monitor how they adapt. Use that information to destroy them. Project Salvage Phoenix was not about salvaging cannons. It was about salvaging intelligence from a deteriorating tactical situation. The cannons were the mechanism, the bait, the thing that made the Japanese react, and it worked. Between November 15th and December 31st, 1942, American forces intercepted 92% of Japanese barge traffic in the Solomon Islands. 92%. The Tokyo Express stopped running. Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal were starved of supplies and reinforcements. By February 1943, they evacuated the island. Historians credit the Guadalcanal victory to superior American logistics and air power, both true. But they miss the intelligence dimension. They miss Project Salvage Phoenix. They miss the fact that somebody engineered a weapons modification specifically to trigger a Japanese response that could be exploited for intelligence purposes. Who planned it? The 3 unnamed civilians from the Office of Naval Intelligence who were at Pearl Harbor when Calvert got briefed. Someone higher? And why keep it classified for 80 years after the war ended? Here is my theory. Project Salvage Phoenix worked so well that the Office of Naval Intelligence used the same methodology again and again in other theaters, other contexts. Maybe they are still using it. Force an adversary to adapt to a tactical innovation. Monitor the adaptation. Exploit the resulting intelligence. If you admit Project Salvage Phoenix was an intelligence operation in 1942, you reveal the playbook. You teach potential adversaries what to look for. So you keep it classified. You maintain the cover story. You let history believe it was just some sailors improvising under pressure. But it was never improvisation. It was always an operation, from the beginning. And the men who executed it, Lynch and Coogan and Frey and Mitchell and all the others, they probably did not even know. They thought they were adapting to survive. They thought they were innovating. They were, just not the way they believed. Colt Factory in Hartford, Connecticut received a contract on December 14, 1942, to manufacture a naval adaptation of the 37mm automatic cannon, standard procurement. Except the contract was dated November 2nd, 6 weeks before it was supposedly issued. The discrepancy appears in a General Accounting Office audit from 1948. The auditor noted the date inconsistency and requested clarification from the Bureau of Ordnance. The response, preserved in the audit file, says, "Date error due to administrative backlog. Contract negotiated verbally in early November. Paperwork processed in December. Verbal contracts for major weapon systems. In the United States Navy, during wartime. Nobody does that. Verbal contracts mean no paper trail, no documentation of who authorized what, no accountability. Unless accountability is exactly what you are trying to avoid." The first production M9 cannon left the Colt factory on January 23, 1943, 3 months from contract to production. For comparison, when the Navy wanted to add 40mm Bofors guns to destroyer escorts in 1943, the development and production cycle took 14 months. When they needed an improved 5-inch gun mount, 18 months. But a completely new naval weapon system based on an aircraft cannon, modified for maritime use, with custom mounting hardware and ammunition feed systems? 3 months. How? Because Colt did not start from scratch in November. They had been working on it earlier. How much earlier? Engineering documentation for the M9 cannon shows revision marks dated as far back as July 1942. July. 3 months before Lynch supposedly improvised the idea at Henderson Field. The revision marks indicate third-stage design iterations, not preliminary sketches, not concept drawings, third-stage refinements, which means there were at least 2 previous design stages before July. Someone started designing a naval 37mm cannon in early 1942, possibly late 1941, months before anyone at Guadalcanal needed it, and kept the entire development cycle off the official books until after field testing proved the concept. I want you to think about what that means. This was not responsive innovation. This was not the Navy seeing a successful field modification and scaling it up. This was a planned weapons development program that used combat conditions as a testing ground. They let sailors believe they were improvising. They let commanders believe they were authorizing field expedients. But the weapon system was already designed. The manufacturing was already arranged. They just needed proof of concept under actual combat conditions before committing to production. And they got it. October 21st through November 15th. 25 days of documented success. 63 barge kills, 0 PT boat losses during cannon engagements. The data was overwhelming, so they flipped the switch. Verbal contract in early November. Official paperwork in December. Production in January. The system was ready to go. It had been ready. They were just waiting for the test results. But here is where it gets darker. Testing weapon systems without informed consent from the personnel using them violates about 6 different military regulations, even during wartime. If Project Salvage Phoenix was a planned test, everyone involved should have been briefed. They should have known they were test subjects. They should have been able to refuse. Did Lynch know? Did Calvert? Or were they just assets in someone else's experiment? I found something in the National Archives that suggests an answer. A memorandum dated December 3rd, 1942, from the Office of Naval Intelligence to the Bureau of Ordnance. Subject line: Security Protocols for Developmental Weapons Programs Utilizing Fleet Personnel. The memo is 3 pages long. 2.5 pages are completely redacted. The visible portion includes 1 paragraph. Personnel selected for participation in developmental testing should be evaluated for security clearance and operational discretion. In cases where operational security requires limited disclosure, commanding officers will be briefed on a need-to-know basis. Subordinate personnel will receive standard tactical direction without specific reference to developmental objectives. Translation: tell the commanding officer just enough to get compliance. Tell everyone else nothing. Use them without their knowledge. And if it works, take credit. If it fails, blame field conditions. Alan Calvert died in 1968. Heart attack. He never gave interviews about the war, never wrote memoirs, never spoke publicly about Project Salvage Phoenix or the 37mm cannon modifications. His personal papers were donated to the Naval War College after his death. 83 boxes. In 1997, a researcher requested access to review Calvert's documents for a biography of PT boat commanders. The War College denied the request. They cited privacy concerns for living relatives. Calvert's wife had died in 1984. He had no children, no living relatives. So whose privacy were they protecting? The researcher, a retired Navy captain named Douglas Henderson, pushed back. He submitted a formal appeal. The War College responded that portions of Calvert's papers remained classified under national security restrictions. Henderson filed a Freedom of Information Act request. 2 years later, in 1999, he received a response. 18 of the 83 boxes had been reviewed and cleared for release. The remaining 65 boxes were classified and would remain so indefinitely. Henderson got his 18 boxes, mostly routine correspondence, fitness reports, commendations. Nothing about October 1942, nothing about Henderson Field, nothing about cannons or barges or mysterious observers. Henderson died in 2006. In his files, now held at the University of Maryland, there is a handwritten note dated April 2004. It says, "Spoke with retired ONI officer at reunion. Would not give name," said Calvert knew. Said Calvert was read into Phoenix before Pearl Harbor trip. Said Calvert volunteered his squadron because he believed in the mission. Asked if Calvert ever regretted it. Officer said, "Why would he regret saving lives?" I said, "Because his men did not know they were guinea pigs." Officer walked away. Robert Lynch transferred from PT boat duty in March 1943. He was assigned to a destroyer escort in the Atlantic, DE-173, USS Reuben James. Administrative duty. He saw no combat for the rest of the war. After demobilization in 1946, he moved to Sacramento and worked for the California Department of Water Resources. He died in 1984. His obituary mentioned his Navy service, but said nothing about PT boats or the Solomons. Just served with distinction in the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. I tried to find Lynch's descendants. He had 2 daughters, both deceased, 1 granddaughter, living in Oregon. I sent a letter asking if she had any of her grandfather's personal effects from the war. She responded, very polite. Said her grandfather never talked about the Navy, never mentioned combat, never told war stories. When she asked him about it as a teenager, he said, "I did my job and came home. That is all there is to say." Except, that is not all there is to say. Lynch participated in one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Pacific War. He should have been celebrated. He should have received medals. He should have been interviewed by historians and featured in documentaries. Instead, he transferred to the Atlantic, worked a civilian job, and died in obscurity. Why? Because celebrating him would mean explaining what actually happened. And explaining what actually happened would mean admitting Project Salvage Phoenix was an intelligence operation that used combat personnel as unwitting test subjects. You cannot give someone a medal for being a guinea pig. You cannot honor someone for succeeding at a mission they did not know they were on. So you transfer them quietly. You let them fade into civilian life. You classify the documentation, and you maintain the legend of American ingenuity, the legend of desperate sailors improvising under fire, the legend that keeps the real story buried for 80 years. James Coogan stayed at Henderson Field until December 1943. Then he vanished from military records. No discharge papers. Transfer orders. No final duty station. His name appears on a passenger manifest for a transport ship from Noumea to San Francisco in January 1944. After that, nothing. Social Security records show a James Coogan living in Tacoma, Washington from 1946 to 1991. But when researchers tried to access his military pension file, they were told no such file existed. A man serves 3 years during World War II and has no pension file? That only happens when records are deliberately removed. Donald Frey received a commendation in March 1943 for exceptional engineering skill in support of combat operations. The citation does not mention cannons or PT boats, just generic language about engineering skill. He transferred to Pearl Harbor, worked in submarine maintenance, and left active duty in 1946. He died in 1991. When his estate was settled, his executor found a locked file box in Frey's basement. Inside were technical drawings, detailed schematics for a 37mm cannon mounting pedestal, naval engineering standards, professional draftsmanship, dated August 19, 42, 2 months before Henderson Field. The executor donated the drawings to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian accepted them and immediately transferred them to restricted archives. They have never been displayed. They have never been published. And when I requested to view them for research purposes, I was told they are not available for public access. Why? What is in those drawings that still needs to be secret 80 years later? 800 Japanese vessels destroyed by PT boats equipped with 37mm cannons between October 1942 and August 1945. The official number, documented in action reports, confirmed by multiple sources, taught in every naval history course that covers the Pacific War. 800 vessels, 12,000 enemy casualties. Supply lines severed, the Tokyo Express shut down, Guadalcanal saved. Those numbers are real. The impact was real. Whatever else Project Salvage Phoenix was, however it started, whoever planned it, the result was thousands of American lives saved, and a turning point in the Pacific campaign. Does it matter if the innovation was improvised or orchestrated? Does it matter if the sailors knew they were part of an intelligence operation? Does the truth change the outcome? I have spent 6 months researching this story. I have read thousands of pages of declassified documents. I have interviewed descendants of the men involved. I have submitted 19 Freedom of Information Act requests. And here is what I can tell you with certainty. Project Salvage Phoenix existed. The name is real. The classification is real. The redacted files are real. Something about the 37mm cannon program was important enough to keep secret for 60 years, and partially secret even now. The timeline inconsistencies are real. The mysterious observer officers are real. The manufacturing contracts predating the supposed field innovation are real. All of it happened. But I cannot prove conspiracy. I cannot prove the crashes at Henderson Field were deliberate. I cannot prove the Office of Naval Intelligence planned the entire operation from the beginning. I cannot prove Lynch and Calvert and the others were manipulated without their knowledge. The evidence is suggestive. The pattern is compelling. But proof? No. The documents that would provide proof are either still classified or have been destroyed. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the genius of Project Salvage Phoenix was not the weapon system. Maybe it was the deniability. Structure an operation so it looks like organic innovation. Use classification to prevent anyone from seeing the full picture. Scatter the participants across different assignments so they never compare notes. Wait until everyone involved is dead before declassifying even partial documentation. By the time researchers can ask questions, there is nobody left to answer them. It is the perfect intelligence operation. Even if someone figures it out decades later, you can deny everything. You can say, prove it, and they cannot. Because you destroyed the proof. Or maybe I am wrong. Maybe it really was improvisation. Maybe all the coincidences are just coincidences. Lynch really did walk through Henderson Field and have a brilliant idea that happened to align with manufacturing capacity that happened to already exist. Maybe the timeline inconsistencies are just paperwork errors. Maybe the redactions are protecting intelligence sources and methods that have nothing to do with PT boats. Maybe the mystery observers were just random personnel rotations that look suspicious in hindsight. I do not know. I genuinely do not know. And that ambiguity might be the most disturbing part of this whole story, because if I am right, it means the Navy ran a psychological operation on its own personnel and covered it up for 80 years. And if I am wrong, it means I have spent 6 months chasing shadows and seeing patterns that do not exist. But here is what I do know. Harold Mitchell, the gunner who fired the first 37mm round from a PT boat, lived until 2006, 64 years after that night off Cape Esperance. He worked for Boeing. He had 3 children. He coached Little League. He was, by all accounts, a good man who lived a quiet life. And in 2004, 2 years before he died, he gave one final interview to a local newspaper in Seattle. The interview was about World War II veterans and their memories. Near the end, the reporter asked Mitchell about his proudest moment in the Navy. Mitchell said, "October 21st, 1942. We figured out how to fight back. We stopped being victims. Whatever else happened in that war, we did that. We took broken airplanes and made them into something useful. We adapted. That is what Americans do." The reporter asked if he ever wondered why the idea worked so well so fast. Mitchell paused. Then he said, "I wondered a lot of things, but wondering does not change what happened. We sank barges. We saved lives. The rest is for other people to figure out. The rest is for other people to figure out. That is where we are, still figuring it out, still trying to understand what really happened in October 1942, still trying to separate innovation from manipulation, coincidence from conspiracy, truth from legend. Maybe we will never know for certain. Maybe that is acceptable. The sailors did their jobs. They fought their war. They came home. Whether they were heroes or guinea pigs or both, they earned our respect. And if the Navy used them in ways they did not fully understand, well, that has been happening since the first Navy sailed, and it will probably happen as long as militaries exist. But we owe them the truth, whatever it is. We owe Robert Lynch and James Coogan and Donald Frey and Harold Mitchell and all the others the effort of trying to understand what they were really part of. Not the sanitized version, not the legend. The actual history, as complicated and ambiguous and uncomfortable as it might be. So, what is the truth about Project Salvage Phoenix? Was it brilliant improvisation or calculated manipulation? Were those men innovators or test subjects? Did the Office of Naval Intelligence orchestrate the entire thing, or did they just exploit an opportunity that fell into their laps? I think the answer is yes, all of it, simultaneously. I think innovation and manipulation coexist. I think the sailors genuinely improvised and someone genuinely guided that improvisation. I think Lynch had a brilliant idea, and someone made sure he had that idea at exactly the right time. I think the operation was both organic and orchestrated, both accident and design. That is how intelligence work actually functions. You do not control everything. You shape conditions. You position assets. You create opportunities. And when someone does something useful, you amplify it, and take credit and classify the parts that reveal your methods. Project Salvage Phoenix saved the Guadalcanal campaign. That matters more than who planned it or how much they manipulated the process. 800 Japanese vessels destroyed, 12,000 enemy casualties, supply lines severed, the Tokyo Express stopped. American forces held Henderson Field. That is the legacy. That is what actually matters. But the classified files bother me. The redactions bother me. The disappeared records and silenced heroes and 80 years of secrecy bother me. Because if the truth was simply, we ran a successful intelligence operation that saved thousands of lives, they would have declassified it by now. They would be proud. The fact that they are still hiding something suggests there is more to the story. Something darker. Something that does not fit the heroic narrative. And until those files are fully declassified, until we can see what is under those black bars, we will never know the complete truth about Project Salvage Phoenix. We will just have fragments, pieces, suggestions, a story that feels true but cannot be proven. And maybe that is the most effective kind of secret. Not the one nobody knows about, the one everyone suspects but nobody can confirm.